If you think that Iran will sign the agreement and calmly comply with it, forget it. This is not a matter of goodwill, it's a matter of the logic of war. Today I'll explain why Tehran can't behave any other way than, well, let's call it cheating, right? The three directions in which it will strike, and why, in fact, we're once again heading down the path of war. Even while there are talks about peace and preparations for a new round of war are happening simultaneously, and one does not negate the other. I understand it sounds strange, but given the logic of what's happening, it's to be expected. I'd even say inevitable. By the way, do you remember Dr. Fauci, who was seriously nicknamed Dr. Death here? Do you remember how Biden, or rather the people around Biden who were actually running the country instead of him, on the last day before leaving, signed Fauci an indulgence, what we call a presidential pardon, which made him immune from prosecution for everything he had done, up until the date this document was issued, until Biden's last day in office, that is. So I have some very good news for you. Fauci might turn out to be not as untouchable as he thought, and as they wanted to make him. This is very good news, thanks to Senator Rand Paul. I'll talk about this a bit later. Today we'll analyze Iran's logic, as that of a country backed into a corner with no military response to the U.S., only asymmetric ones. So there are three specific targets that Tehran will keep striking, just as Israel and the U.S. are already making a list of targets for a preemptive strike for the next strike. What's happening with the Iranian Empire? Influence in Iraq and Lebanon and Gaza? Well, little by little, but every day, which is also nice. And separately, the double game of your favorite Russia, which verbally supports Iran, but in reality just pumps and sells oil for, you won't believe it, its own profit, no matter who suffers from it or how bad it gets. Also on today's program, what America uncovered from its own Democratic Party while the whole world was watching Iran, the biggest medical fraud bust in the country's history. Fraud, a specific story about how they stole from the elderly, from children, from people with autism, and even from the deceased. A New York story with a $10 billion program that was embezzled right under the state's nose, and the state pretended not to notice, turned away, yes. And why did no one even mention this under the Democrats, but now everything is suddenly falling apart? Well, let's start with the cold logic of war without moralizing. A war is being waged against Iran right now, military, economic, and intelligence. Tehran has no symmetrical military response. It physically cannot strike the U.S. or Israel with comparable force or inflict damage of similar magnitude. And when a party in a conflict has no way to respond militarily, but has a strong need to show that it hasn't given up, it shifts to maximizing damage. It inflicts damage where it can. This is not an excuse, it's just the mechanics. Put almost any government in the place of the Iranian leadership. Any government that has been cornered like that would most likely behave in a very similar way. To expect a side that's being held at gunpoint to act honestly and by the rules is, at the very least, naive, and so on. Let's dive into the pressing topic of war. And later we'll talk about the Democrats, about the schemes they've pulled off. Oh, they've pulled them off. About how they've covered for each other. Oh, they've covered for each other, including the well-known and infamous Dr. Fauci, who thought he was untouchable. He doesn't think so anymore. And now to the Persian Gulf and its impact on the whole world. Three specific reasons follow from Iran's logic. The first direction is where Iran will continue to strike. Well, no matter what's written and signed on paper. The first is the Strait of Hormuz, through which oil goes, flows, crawls. This is a confirmed fact, not a prediction. Since the beginning of the war, dozens of attacks on tankers and ships in the strait have been recorded. Iran mined the waters, fired on ships, and demanded payment for passage, even when the parties formally agreed to open the strait. On June 20, Iran again announced its closure, accusing Israel of violating the agreement, an accusation that the American authorities immediately publicly denied. Israel was never a party to this agreement, so it can't be a party that violated something it never signed. But Iran doesn't care, right? It uses any excuse it can, and who can, as they say, blame them for that, in this sense. What do they throw there? Tomatoes. What kind of tomato? Oh, well, stewed, not stewed, rotten, yes, a rotten tomato, right? Spoiled, basically, second. I got confused with the tomatoes. Bombardment of oil, rotten, that's it, they throw rotten tomatoes. Second, then, is the bombardment of oil fields and the energy infrastructure of the Persian Gulf countries. That's also a confirmed fact. Iranian missiles and drones struck targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates, and Saudi Arabia throughout the war, including oil refining facilities on the islands of Lebanon and Syria. The IRGC openly warned that an escalation of the conflict could send the price of oil to $200 per barrel. That is, Iran is directly using the threat to the Gulf's energy infrastructure as leverage. As they say, they use whatever they have. Third, the civilian population of Israel. Hundreds of rockets and drones have been launched at Israeli cities since the very beginning of the war. This is also not a hypothesis, but a documented fact, so to speak. Everything has been documented. This is a documented and, so to speak, established practice that has already taken place. A simple conclusion follows from this. Israel and the United States are now essentially forced to draw up a list of targets for preemptive strikes, specifically along these three lines, not because they want escalation, but because they understand that if they don't strike these points first and destroy Iran's ability to hit them, the strikes will happen anyway. In other words, the more active diplomacy is on paper, the more intense the parallel preparations to neutralize these three threat vectors by military means become. This is the very paradox I mentioned at the beginning, right? Talks about peace and preparations for a new round of war are happening at the same time. One does not cancel out the other. And now, what matters? This is what you should remember best from this video. A little later, I will tell you exactly how, piece by piece, literally little by little, but every day, what is commonly called the Iranian Empire of Influence is falling apart in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Gaza. Individual news items may seem insignificant, yes, but if you put them together, say, over the course of a month, the picture is staggering. It's truly fascinating to watch the dismantling and the end of an empire in real time. Well, Iraq, for example, you might ask what I'm talking about. Let's start with Iraq. The Trump administration openly linked military cooperation and funding for Baghdad, that's Iraq, to real steps against the pro-Iranian group. Many of these formations are officially listed on the Iraqi state budget and are integrated into the country's security apparatus, but in reality, they are not under the government's control. The Iraqi government decided that American money is a very convincing argument, so taking advantage of Iran's weakening, they went on the offensive. And this is a good sign that they see Iran as the losing side in this conflict. And this week, something happened that just a year ago seemed absolutely unthinkable. Two of the most influential pro-Iranian groups in Iraq, Asaib al-Haq and its allies, announced that they are starting to hand over their weapons to the Iraqi authorities, and they created a commission to inventory the fighters and equipment. Not all of them. That means Kataib Hezbollah, a well-known organization, and a less familiar one to me, Harakat al-Nujaba, refused to disarm, appealing to sovereignty in the presence of foreign troops. But the very fact that some major pro-Iranian groups agreed to disarm is a crack that would have been unimaginable just a week ago. And Iraq struck with all its might at those who refused to disarm. Their headquarters say that fighters are dying, that equipment is exploding. For the fifth day now, by the way, exactly as long as the Kurdish attack on Aksir inside Iran itself has lasted, a real war of annihilation against pro-Iranian forces is raging in Lebanon. The Israeli army is methodical, deliberate, unhurried. It continues its advance in the south of the country, and according to available data, they have already reached the outskirts of several key settlements. By the way, one of the senior commanders of Hezbollah's intelligence has been killed. Ali Musa Dagdu has been found and eliminated. This is the man who once organized an attack that took the lives of 5 American soldiers in Iraq. According to reports, finally in June, Hezbollah closed most of its training camps. The organization is physically losing the ability to train new fighters. Why aren't there any new fighters? Well, there aren't many crazy people. They're all being killed, beaten. That is, when it was possible, so to speak, to get big money for nothing, just for driving around in cars, shooting in the air, or when no one shot back at you when you fired. That's one thing. When they shoot back at you and kill you, that's a completely different story. On June 26, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced a framework agreement between Israel and Lebanon. With American mediation, the agreement requires Hezbollah to lay down their arms and leave the south of the country. For now, from the south. The Hezbollah leadership itself rejected this framework, but on June 30, the parties still agreed to establish a committee to end the war. You know, gentlemen, I've been in Israel for a long time. I was told about how things were before the war between Israel and Lebanon, how people were friends, how they visited each other, how they traveled to Beirut. I talked about this. They already called it the Little Paris or Paris, the Paris of the Middle East, and so on, and how in one day it all ended, all these years. Lebanon after the attack. When was it, right? After the attack. In 48, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Right? Maybe 40 and 47 or 48, most likely. Did not recognize. Israel wanted, the Lebanese said, we will be the second to recognize you. Tarifsha, they are a small country. They were afraid that some influence would affect them, let's say, and that we would immediately follow them. Right? Nevertheless, they were afraid, they were captured, they were humiliated, they were killed, their lives were completely changed. They dreamed of returning to normal relations with Israel. And so, for the first time in many years, they sat down across from each other, not secretly but openly in the presence of America, and said, well, guys, we need to put an end to this mess. Let's try together to drive Hezbollah out of the territory of Lebanon. Hezbollah says it will not disarm, but in practice it loses territory, commanders, and training infrastructure day by day. But that's not the funniest part. The funniest part is still in Russia, because here there's a real double game going on. They just say one thing and do another. Thankfully, sometimes people say nasty things but act well, rather than saying good things and acting badly. And Russia is just, that's, as they say, the real kicker, the best part. Yeah. In words, Moscow demonstrates solidarity with Tehran when voting in the UN Security Council on a resolution condemning attacks by Iran and its proxies on an Arab state and its civilians. Well, Russia, together with China, abstained, not supporting pressure on Iran. But in fact, Russia's strategy is extremely selfish. While the region is in turmoil, Russia simply pumps and sells as much oil as possible at the highest possible price, extracting maximum profit from someone else's war. Regardless of how this affects Iran itself or global prices, it's beneficial for Iran to have less oil on the market. They squeezed everyone and are holding back, and while oil prices are rising, nothing of the sort. Russia doesn't care. It extracts and sells as much as it can immediately. It doesn't care at all, or maybe not deeply, maybe from far away. Russia's revenues from fossil fuel exports are growing every month. So, as far as I remember, pipeline exports increased by about 20 or 22%, and loading at the U.S. Luga port, I think, grew by 50%. So, well, the guys are really enjoying life. Analysts from the Kiev School of Economics, by the way, directly point out in their baseline scenario the continuation of the Middle Eastern conflict. Russia's oil revenues in 2026 could grow from $158 to more than $200 billion. So, wow. So, well, 160, 200. How much does that come out to for us, right? 40, 20, 20%. Russia needs this money for one purpose, of course, to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. So don't be fooled by the rhetoric about brotherly solidarity with Tehran. Moscow in this story is acting solely in its own interests. And for Russia, well, Iran is not an ally, but simply a convenient source of higher prices for its own goods. No matter how bad this is for Tehran, the more war there is in the Persian Gulf, the more the Kremlin likes it. It's Harno for the Kremlin, if I understand that word correctly. So let's put the picture together. Iran objectively cannot and will not honestly abide by any agreements, because its entire negotiation strategy is based on one thing: buying time. buying time, bargaining for access to frozen funds, to continue causing maximum damage in three areas: the Strait, the Gulf's oil infrastructure, and the civilian population of Israel, for as long as it is physically possible. For as long as it is physically possible. And that's why Israel and the U.S. are preparing lists of targets for preemptive strikes, as they say, preemption, exactly along these three vectors. And at the same time, regardless of what is happening in the negotiations in Doha, every day, piece by piece, the entire architecture of Iranian influence in the region is falling apart. In Iraq, the militia is giving up its weapons. In Lebanon, Hezbollah is losing ground and commanders. Instead of providing real support, Russia is simply profiting from the misfortune of others. This is the true picture of what is happening. It's much more complicated and far less clear-cut than the pretty headlines about imminent peace and attacks on our friend, and so on. By the way, all the new videos, all the short articles, and my personal comments on current events are on my Telegram channel, which has the same name as this channel on YouTube, Live in Vainstain US. The link is below this video. Subscribe so you don't miss anything. Because events are changing faster than these informative videos come out. Yes, the situation is complicated. An empire built on fear and proxy wars rarely collapses beautifully or all at once. It doesn't just collapse with a boom. No, it's all happening. It's disgustingly slow and so on. But pay attention to the main thing. It really is collapsing, step by step, day by day. In Iraq, in Lebanon, in Iran itself, and the side that is methodically and patiently dismantling someone else's system of influence is objectively in a much stronger position than the side that is trying to hold on to this system at any cost, including deceiving their own negotiating partners. Time in this story is not on Tehran's side, whatever they may think. And now let's move on to America and the political games that all sides are playing ahead of the November elections. On June 23, the U.S. Department of Justice announced the results of the largest healthcare fraud crackdown in the country's history. Charges have been filed against 455 participants, including 90 doctors and other healthcare workers. Some of them came to the U.S. from the territory of the former USSR. For a total amount of over $6.5 billion in false claims. 56 federal districts, 45 states and territories are involved, and a record 50 regional Medicaid fraud control units. That means literally every state at the same time. Assets have been seized. Assets, physical ones like cars, cash, luxury cars, jewelry worth $182 million. This is the first step. Some of the suspects were even caught around the world and brought to the U.S., from northern Cyprus, Estonia, from the Philippines. The search was going on all over the world. Those who managed to escape to Russia or China are still at large for now. The rest were arrested and extradited. And now let's get into the specifics, because it is exactly this that shows the full cynicism of what is happening. In California, in my state, the owner of a hospice company. Well, hospice is what those companies do. It includes caring for terminally ill patients, let's say. His accomplices are accused of fraud amounting to $27.7 million. The hospice is a small company. The scheme was as follows. They paid bribes to funeral home employees for information about the recently deceased, and then, well, all the information is there. Social security number, name, address, everything else. And then they billed for care, hospice care, yes, supposedly provided to these people who were already dead. As you can understand, no one dug them up from their graves or provided this care. That means they were already dead at the time of receiving this. I'm sorry for laughing. I'm not laughing at the dead, as you understand. At the same time, fake medical records were being fabricated to deceive anyone who might come to check, and no inspectors ever came. A group of 8 people accused of a $38 million fraud scheme has been uncovered in New York. Through a network, well, they call them adult daycare centers, but we call them kindergartens for adults. In short, the perpetrators allegedly paid bribes for the personal data of potential patients and then billed for services supposedly provided to hundreds of people a day. So they came to us, we sent for them, we had vehicles, we fed and gave them drinks, we checked their blood pressure, we did singing and dancing with them and so on, and we called doctors. Well, basically, in rooms where it was physically impossible to serve 10 or 15 people, they were writing down hundreds at the same time. In Lenos, the person involved billed Medicaid for 500 hours of consulting and therapeutic services per day. Once again, 500 hours billed per day. He personally, it's not like there were 25 people. He personally alone billed 500 hours per day. He worked like that for many years, and nobody noticed. So, gentlemen, if anyone thinks this is physically possible, please write in the comments. There you go. I don't even want to comment on this. Not a single regulatory authority has ever checked him, even though everyone has computers. Maybe he paid well so they'd turn a blind eye. 500 hours every day. For many years. With the stolen $27 million, he opened brokerage accounts, his own luxury cars, bought real estate, jewelry, very expensive watches, many pairs. He was caught at the airport while trying to leave the country. That's a separate painful topic. A painful topic. This is therapy for children with autism. Here, let's say since 2009, from 2009 to 2024. Medicaid expenses, which is a public health care program for applied behavioral therapy for people with autism, suddenly increased by 403%. Suddenly. This is the fastest growing segment of the program, and it's completely unclear why or where it came from. It's quite difficult to verify the actual amount needed for a specific child, but 404%. But 10, but 5, but 8, but 3. There should be a decrease, theoretically, right? They take good care, there's something else. No, it increased by 403%. This is what they call unscrupulous companies in America. Well, crooks. They took advantage of this because for some reason no one was checking them. Entire funds were organized, people invested together. And they opened companies like that for taking care of autistic people. But there were no autistic people there at all. There was just a company, just a building. And there was someone inside who supposedly checked and said, yes, everything is fine. So who was it? Who? Maybe this is already known, I don't know. Or maybe it will be revealed during the trial. This is the most important question of all. And finally, New York. New York. That's a whole separate painful story. The Justice Department filed a lawsuit against the state authorities and their public company, which, was called Public Partnership, accusing them of organizing a fake tender, as a result of which a single company gained control over a $10 billion in-home care program for people with disabilities. Well, how could that happen, right? Not hundreds of companies each getting a piece, but just one, and without anyone else participating as, a competitor. Since then, the company has been raking in profits for years at the taxpayers' expense, while the state authorities have been deliberately turning a blind eye to it, even though, of course, they've known about the contract violations from the very beginning. Why do you think no one stopped this fraud? $10 billion. Write in the comments what you think. Did no one know? Or was it something else? Now we know that they knew. By the way, nobody cared. Or was there another reason? Separately, this same week, the New York Comptroller and the State Attorney General announced the uncovering of a network of fake, so-called eye clinics. Someone, you'll be pleased to hear, Maxim Grinberg, an interesting name for an American, set up 8 companies under the name iPick, which billed Medicaid. Well, the program, a medical one, for eye surgeries that never actually took place. Well, at least it's good that he didn't actually perform those surgeries. I know doctors who performed these surgeries even though there was absolutely no need to do them. So, a little more than $9 million was stolen, spent on mansions in New Jersey, some medical and jewelry items, as well as a collection of Audi, Bentley, Porsche, and Lamborghini cars. That's just the $9 million you discussed. It's unclear how much more Maxim paid for silence and how many people he paid. Maybe to someone with the same background. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on. The main question of this episode is the very one we should ask out loud and not be afraid to answer. Why is this only coming to light now? The schemes we've talked about clearly weren't built in just a week, years. Years of obvious statistical anomalies, which were impossible not to notice. Well, how can you suddenly increase spending on something tenfold in a year and not notice it? By 403% over 3 years and not notice it, right? Why, all these years while the Democratic Party was running Washington and most of the mentioned states, was nothing like this uncovered on a large scale? The answer is obvious. Apparently, part of the stolen money had been flowing for years back into party structures, through donations, through connected contractors, through a politically convenient reluctance to dig deeper in their own domains. Well, that's my interpretation, of course, of what's happening, not a legally proven fact. But my logic is simple. As long as the people in power were interested in ignoring the problem, the anomalies remained statistical noise. So who is paying attention to it? What did they find? What do you think? And now, when the federal government actually started digging, even Democratic states, well, like New York, suddenly rushed to review their own investigations and raids. Why? Well, I'll give my guess and you give yours. Because they got scared that the feds would nail them. What, you didn't see that? Now the promise bonus. Dr. Anthony Fauci Donald, Dr. Death. On January 19th, 2025, on his last day in office, the President of the United States of America, Joe Biden. God, it's such a relief that he's already the ex-president. Granted Dr. Anthony Fauci a full and unconditional pardon for any offenses. Well, I mean, like if on his way to the White House he killed a secretary, strangled her, raped her, cut her up, mailed her to himself, ate her, bit her, I didn't fry her, right? Right? It doesn't matter at all. Technically, if he did it before January 19th, 2025, well, since 2014, and they were only interested in the time when he was directly working for the Democratic Party, from 2014 to January 19th, 2025, because on the 20th of January, Trump became president. So pay attention to the wording, the absolutely remarkable wording. The pardon only covers what happened before January 19th, 2025. That is, until the moment when Biden physically left the White House. Music to my ears. Anything that Fauci says or does after that date is not covered by the pardon. June 18th, on his last day in office, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard released more than 200 pages of previously classified documents and correspondence, which show that Fauci, according to her, manipulated the Russian intelligence community, concealed information about the origin of the virus, and lied to Congress, and of course under oath. Well, they're in, say, 2024, right? However, this was before Biden's term ended, which means theoretically it would be covered by that very pardon. By the way, before Biden, there were never such pardons, at least as far as I checked. Pardons were always for something very specific, like reducing a sentence for a particular reason. Or, for example, someone served 5 years out of 15 and they said, "All right, that's enough, you can go." There were always specific reasons for it. Sometimes there were reasons, sometimes positive ones, and sometimes, from my point of view, completely wrong ones. You never know, maybe someone gave a bribe to someone, right? Now, theoretically, everything that happened up to this date is covered by the pardon. But then Senator Rand Paul, who had been seeking criminal prosecution of Fauci for years, summoned him with a subpoena to testify again before the Senate Committee on Homeland Security. Fauci first agreed to come voluntarily, then refused. And on June 22, Paul sent him an official court subpoena. Now he can't refuse like that anymore. If he refuses, he will be brought in by force, as they say. The testimony is expected, I think, still in June, right? No, you think it's at the very beginning of July, right? Although maybe not the 30th. Let me figure something out. Figure it out. It's already July now, gentlemen. What am I saying? Oh, by the end of July, right? That's it. Sorry. That's the catch. If at these new hearings, which will take place now in the summer of 2026, Fauci again starts denying under oath things that directly contradict the documents recently released by Gabbard, This new lie to Congress will happen after January 19th, 2025. That means Biden's presidential pardon simply doesn't cover it. Fauci faces a choice with no good option. Either lie under oath again and get a new criminal case not protected by any pardons, or admit it under oath. That he lied to Congress, broke laws, acted against orders, directives, instructions, and so on. Which is also, well, let's put it this way, destructive for his reputation, but he will survive it. But this opens up space for new lawsuits. Here are both options. This is a major problem for a person who they spent so many years trying to make untouchable, because he is the key to a huge number of court cases. And here is the answer to the question that many have been asking for years. Is it even possible to hold accountable those who seem to be reliably protected by the system, the party, and their own pardons? It turns out it is possible. If the Democratic machine has relied for years on the idea that they don't turn in their own. And they don't notice the problems, they just walk right past them. It doesn't matter how bad it is for the country, it doesn't matter how terrible it is for the people. The main thing is that their side doesn't lose. But it turned out that if you really want to take a look, everything practically comes to light on its own. And that's good news not about politics, but about the system itself. It can still clean itself up, even if it takes a long time. Ladies and gentlemen, after all, this is America, not Zimbabwe. Although they're really trying to turn us into exactly that, yes, whether it's a banana republic or Marzova or some other kind of republic or just tyranny, dictatorship, and so on. See you in the next episode.